And thank you for joining us today for this session on climate justice in EbA. So what is climate resilience or just resilience in our context? So first of all, a few housekeeping rules. So we're going to be recording the session. So if you don't want to be recorded, please keep your camera turned off and you can make your comments through the chat. We do kindly ask everyone to mute themselves when you're not speaking, so just that we have a better audio quality. And yeah, you can use the chat always to ask questions. Also, if you need some clarification on the spot because you're not following. So that would be that. And now let me see how I can stop my sharing. I don't know how to do that with this. Okay. Can someone take over? Präsentation beenden. Here, got it. Okay. So welcome again, everyone. So my name's Erinda. I'm an advisor for the global project Mainstreaming Ecosystem-Based Adaptation for Climate Change. I am today going to be your moderator for this session. And actually, before we get started on this very important topic, I would like to pose some questions to you just so that we get a feeling of who is here with us in this room. So first, we would like to know what country you're from, and I hope that the quiz question is pulling up. I hope you can see it. Perfect. So we have someone from Costa Rica. From Philippines, from Thailand, from the US. Wonderful. Okay. So now we would like to know what sector you work in so that we also kind of get a feeling of what your background is. And bear with me because I'm trying to multitask here. It should be pulling up now. Yes. So we've got some people from INGOs, international development, other. Okay, so if you are from an other organization that's not here, please post it in the chat so we know what you're working for. Would be interesting to know.
Yeah, it's maybe not so much interesting because it's consultancy, and even though we talked about the list, I didn't realize that that was missing.
We have someone from the national or local government. That's great. Welcome. Okay. So we have another question to get you warmed up a little bit as well. We would like to know if you've already worked on EbA. I'm assuming yes, but we would be surprised. Sometimes there is new people that are new to the context of EbA, so we would like to know that, just so that we also know how much we are all in a common understanding. So far, everyone's yes. Okay, good. So we don't need to explain the basics. And then finally, we would like to know if you are familiar with the concepts of just resilience and climate justice. So far, yes, somewhat. Okay, so everyone is somewhere familiar with it. That's great. So we don't have such a hard time with the introductions on the topic. And we will hopefully learn some new things. I'm thinking the other quiz questions, I'm going to keep them until after and see how much everyone listened to your presentation, Christine. So I'm going to actually introduce Christine now, who's our first speaker. So Christine Locci is an associate consultant with FACT. As an economist, she has been working on climate change adaptation, disaster risk reduction, and sustainable agriculture in the Development Corporation for 20 years. She has been accompanying organizations like GIZ, Bread for the World, and other NGOs in climate-related processes. And currently, she is supporting the GIZ Global Project Mainstreaming EbA, so us, in the ongoing work on climate justice, which we're very happy. So over to you, Christina. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Erinda. And I am also very happy to be talking to you. And before I start, I just wanted to mention that this work that I'm doing and that part of which I am presenting today, I'm doing together with my colleague Mario, who's also here. And so, yeah, hi, Mario. So I will be sharing my screen. Just give me a second. So can you see the screen? Erinda, can you give me a quick feedback?
Yes, we can see it.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. So I'm very happy to give you an introduction into climate justice in the context of EBA and what's been happening in the international context. And I'm sure you're going to hear some things that you already know, but I hope that we can, bring you some things that you maybe not know already. And before I start, I mean, the title session is Just Transition and Just Resilience. And just to quickly mention, for us, just transition is really about decarbonization of the economy, keeping in mind the principles of fairness and really providing or really making sure that catastrophic climate change doesn't happen as much as we fear it will. And so it's really the basis also for just resilience. But as we're here and talking about EBA, of course, we will also be looking at just resilience and not so much at just transition. This being said, why are we talking about climate justice in EBA? So as you probably all know, NBS, nature-based solutions, are internationally on the rise, that ecosystem-based approaches are gaining attention. We can see it in the discussion on agroecology. We can see it in carbon markets. We can see it in different initiatives that have been launched. For example, the Glasgow Leaders Declaration on Forest and Land Use and many, many others. And at the same time, the international criticism is also rising. And one of the points where it was most obvious was the official text of the Glasgow Climate Pact, so the climate COP last year, which did not include the term NBS, but replaced it with the phrase protecting, conserving, and restoring nature. And this was really due to the criticism by civil society, by indigenous peoples and local communities, but also by some countries. And another kind of point or central point of criticism is that NBS really has a strong focus on mitigation and on reducing or compensating greenhouse gas emissions by planting and protecting trees, and that there have been negative impacts on local communities and indigenous people's rights through NBS. And there's just two examples in mitigation projects, for example, the Barro Blanco Dam in Latin America, which was funded or financed under the Clean Development Mechanism, but also in nature conservation projects, for example, the human rights violations that were documented in national parks in Africa. And what we also see is that the principles of climate justice are increasingly being recognized internationally as essential aspects for climate change adaptation. There's a long history of talking about climate justice, demanding climate justice from civil society movements, also scientific research on environmental justice. And we see in kind of recent time that there's more research, more project activities from different international actors on climate justice in NBS. And for example, papers produced by the SEI, the Stockholm Environment Institute, or IISD, IUCN has been working on it, many different others that I cannot all mention. What we also see is that in official communications, for example, by the G7 or other kind of government actors, that there's more differentiation on the vulnerability of social groups, which we haven't seen in earlier years, but there's not so much a recognition of specific rights of these groups. And most recently, the sixth assessment report from the IPCC for the first time clearly stated that equity and justice in adaptation planning and implementation lead to more effective and sustainable adaptation outcomes and reduces risks and fosters participation and ownership. So this is really a breakthrough in one of the core documents on climate change. And the IPCC also spelled out climate justice as a rights-based approach to addressing climate change, and that it covers different dimensions. And the three that are mentioned in the IPCC report is that it's about recognition justice, so recognition of different types of values, of different types of knowledge, It's about procedural justice, so access to planning of projects, to implementation, but also to grievance mechanisms. And it's about distributive justice on the costs and benefits by EBA interventions or adaptation interventions in general. And in the discussion, there's also an additional dimension, which is the retributive or restorative justice, which takes into account past injustices by climate change. So what are we understanding as climate justice in EBA, and in the work that we have been doing with Erinda, with Mario, with talking to many different people, we saw really three dimensions that are interlinked, and that climate justice accounts for the specific sets of rights of distinct peoples and traditional communities, and that it's part of human rights principles. And that ecosystem-based approaches for adaptation should be non-discriminatory, transparent, accountable, and meaningfully participatory in their design and execution. And that these two things together ensure that there are equitable and fair outcomes of climate change policies and projects. So what we looked at is also, how can you actually, how is climate justice featured in the international frameworks? And I just want to give you a quick run through through the three main conventions that we, or the three main international systems that we looked at. The first is the CBD, and there we saw that already in 1998, ecosystem management was stated as a societal choice, and that it should be based on indigenous and local knowledge next to other types of knowledge. And in 2010, the Nagoya Protocol on Access and Benefit Sharing acknowledged indigenous and local communities and their established rights to grant access to genetic resources, and established the need for a prior informed consent from these communities and an equitable benefit sharing, and that it should also, that any interventions, any projects should keep in mind customary laws and procedures, as well as customary use and exchange of genetic resources. And in addition, it established community protocols as a minimum requirement, which enables communities to, have agreed terms and contractual clauses with project implementers, with national governments on how to do the access and benefit sharing, also based on the traditional knowledge. So in the CBD, we see that there's a long history of aiming to base natural resource management on this traditional knowledge, and to also include indigenous and local communities in the development of biodiversity conservation projects. For the climate convention, so the UNFCCC, the picture is a bit different. The Paris Agreement recognizes human rights in its preamble and also mentions local communities and indigenous peoples. And for Article 7 on adaptation, it emphasizes that adaptation should be based on participatory approaches and on traditional knowledge of local communities and indigenous peoples. But in practice, there's not so much concrete guidance. So the national climate policies, like the NDCs, like the NAPs, they have very limited guidance on how this participation of indigenous peoples and local communities should actually happen. So it's very much up to the different countries how to do that. The UNFCCC did launch a local communities and indigenous peoples platform for information sharing in 2017, which is active also within the negotiations. And so for us, there's a weaker international framework in the climate convention to protect the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities. They are recognized as being important, but it's not really clear. There's no clear guidance how this actually should be put in practice. For the human rights systems, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples from 2017, of course, is a key document because it establishes the right to free, prior, and informed consent for indigenous peoples. And last year, there was also this resolution, or a resolution on the human right to a clean and healthy environment, which also explicitly mentions the inclusion of local communities for the implementation of this human right. There are also special rapporteurs, for example, on the rights of indigenous peoples, that had a report on climate change and climate finance in 2017, and a special rapporteur on climate change created last year, which should identify existing challenges to promote and protect human rights in climate change policies. So the human rights system of the UN provides the basis for really enhancing the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities in the context of EBA. And in addition, what we see kind of as the next step is that there are many safeguards and standards at different levels. There are the international recognized standards, for example, the IUCN Global Standard on NBS. We have standards and safeguards by international climate and biodiversity funds. The multilateral development banks and bilateral donors also have safeguards which should protect the rights of the local communities and indigenous peoples, and the larger implementing entities like UNDP, UNEP, or IUCN, they also have standards and safeguards. So there are rules how how actors implementing EBA projects should ensure climate justice, should ensure access for everyone to their projects. And yet, there seems to be a missing link, because there is this criticism. There are these examples that where things did not go well, and where there were human rights violations, there were really negative impacts on local communities through NBS projects, and probably more mitigation, or not probably more mitigation, but also potentially for EBA projects. So the question is, how does this policy translate into practice? And what we see is that there's been some progress. There is a recognition of the specific role and rights of indigenous peoples. FPIC is a principle that is mentioned in many of the more recent safeguards. There's also the development of indigenous peoples' policies or plans for projects, for EBA projects. There's also an increased recognition of unofficial or traditional systems, for example, on land rights, land tenure, or intangible and intangible cultural heritage. And we do see more provisions and guidance on meaningful stakeholder consultations. At the same time, we see loopholes because the large international funds, they rely on the standards of the implementing entities and agencies, and they don't always have a minimum standard that needs to be adhered. And we also see weak formulation, where feasible, seek to avoid. These are formulations that still give the space not to really adhere to strict standards when it comes to climate justice. There are limiting conditions in the implementation, like short project duration, planning processes, or access to stakeholders, and the important issue of country ownership, and also that, you know, this, of course, projects have to adhere to national law, that can provide a loophole for strict standards. But of course, on the other hand, it's also an important tool to ensure a control through national institutions what happens in their countries. So from our side, the question is, how can we contribute to bridging the gap between theory and practice for just EBA, and how can climate justice work in practice? And I'm really happy, I'm closing now, and I'm very happy that my colleague Katie from IUCN will give us some more insights on how this can actually work in practice. So over to you, Arinda, and thanks a lot for listening.
Thank you very much for this overview, Christine. And by popular demand, we're actually going to continue with the next input directly, and then we will have a discussion at the end. And I think this makes sense because it will give a better overview of everything, both the theory and the practice, and then we can go into the Q&A. So with that, I would like to introduce Katie. Katie Bimson is the Program Officer for Water, Wetlands, and Nature-Based Solutions for the Climate at the IUCN Asia Regional Office. She has been working on wetlands in Southeast Asia for at least 9 years and is currently coordinating the regional implementation of a number of projects related to nature-based solutions in wetlands in the Lower Mekong Basin. Ms. Bimson is also supports the Secretariat for the Indo-Burma Ramsar Regional Initiative, working closely with the governments of Cambodia, Laos, PDR, Myanmar, Thailand, and Vietnam to strengthen the implementation of the Ramsar Convention in the region. So with that, we're really excited to hear from you, Katie. Over to you. Thanks.
Great. Thanks for the introduction, Arinda, and thanks, Christine, for kind of setting the global scene. So I'll just try and give us a short example of what it looks like in practice, hopefully. So let me just share my screen here. And I hope you guys can see that. Can you confirm, Arinda? Yes? All good.
Yes.
All right. So as Arinda mentioned, my name is Katie and I work at the IUCN Asia Regional Office. So I help our country teams to implement regional projects on the ground. And today I'll be talking about our Mekong Wet project and the idea of building resilience of wetlands, focusing on the lower Mekong basin, but hopefully being able to expand this idea and doing this through the development of a Ramsar regional initiative. So this project was funded by BMU IKI. I think there's someone from IKI in the room, so thank you for your support, and implemented by IUCN with a number of other partners who I'll discuss a bit during this presentation. So the overall objective of the project was really to develop a framework that allowed us to deliver ecosystem-based adaptation and mitigation benefits from Ramsar sites or wetlands of international importance, as well as other wetlands of importance in the region that the countries helped us to identify. And we really had a big focus on enhancing transboundary and regional cooperation on wetlands. We realized this was a huge gap in the area. Lots of different countries working on wetlands and Ramsar sites, but there was no platform for them to get together and to share ideas. So the project was intended to be implemented over 4 years, but it is still ongoing due to COVID. And it will be ending this year in September. Initially, it focused on 10 wetlands in Cambodia, Laos PDR, Thailand, and Vietnam, and was expanded to include wetlands in Myanmar in the final phase of the project during the small grants component. One of the big accomplishments of the project, as mentioned in the title, was to develop this Indo-Burma Ramsar regional initiative. So this initiative brought together national Ramsar focal points from each of the 5 countries, NGOs, INGOs, Ramsar international organization partners, who are all working on different components within wetlands, and really brought these people together and served as a platform to share ideas, best practices, and to help the countries learn from each other, because this was a kind of missing in the region, if you will. And because, of course, in this region, there's a lot of connection between the wetlands with the Mekong River running through all of the countries, it seemed like an obvious thing that hadn't been done yet. So we developed this Ramsar Regional Initiative, or EbA, and we also conducted trainings to build capacity of government staff and park rangers who are making decisions on wetlands, and really worked to highlight their understanding of the role of wetlands in climate change adaptation and mitigation, so that when they're making decisions on wetlands and wetlands management, they're really keeping this idea in mind of the many ecosystem services provided by wetlands, and that they understand the future of wetlands under future climate scenarios. One of the first things we did during the project was to develop a climate change vulnerability assessment tool. So this tool was focused on wetlands specifically. It's available online. I can share the link after if anyone is interested. But there's 3 main components of the tool. And the first component is looking at how climate change currently and in the future will affect key species in the wetland. So whether the community and stakeholders decide that those are species that are, a keystone species or a unique endemic species, maybe a critically endangered species, or even just a species that their livelihood is very dependent on, and it's very economically important. Those species were selected. They were used in the tool to understand how in the future climate change will affect the abundance and presence of these species at the site. Also looking at ecosystems within the wetland, so seeing how different parts of the wetland will react to the changes in the climate. For example, flooded forests, if they're inundated for longer periods of time, how will that change? Or mangroves, how will they react to sea level rise? So lots of different components depending on which ecosystem you're looking at. And finally, looking at local livelihoods. So what we did was we worked very closely with communities to map the habitats within the wetland and the resources that they use from those habitats. And we developed seasonal calendars to see when they're using those resources and when they depend on them the most. Once we had this information, we also did a survey with them on how they're coping with climate change now. What are they doing now that they didn't need to do 30 years ago? So speaking to the elders in the community. And if these climate change impacts continue, how will they deal with that in the future? So we could understand their risk and what we needed to look out for in the future, given the information we knew from the climate projections of the sites. So after we completed these VAs and we had the results and we went back to the communities in the 10 focal wetlands to kind of validate the results of the vulnerability assessment, we worked with them to develop these ecosystem-based adaptation or EBA measures. So this was one of the first kind of big challenges of the project, I would say. So once we brought these results of the climate change VAs to them, many people immediately went to wanting to implement gray infrastructure approaches. So one of the communities, for example, that is having difficulty accessing water during the dry season immediately said, we want huge water tanks. And so a big part of this project was trying to explain EBA, because of course it was a new concept, a new term for them, but not necessarily a new concept, and to promote all of the additional benefits of ecosystem-based adaptation measures that gray infrastructure just doesn't give us. And explaining to them, you know, in the meantime, it might take a little bit more time to be effective, but over long term, we see this as being really beneficial for you, and seeing what they thought on that, and working with them to establish trade-offs to make sure that we were meeting their needs in the immediate future, but that we were also promoting these ecosystem-based adaptation measures and sharing our ideas with them. So once we had a list of EBA measures, so measures that really provided benefits to the communities and addressed these climate threats, but also provided biodiversity benefits, we worked with them to develop kind of a preliminary cost benefit analysis for each of the options. And we had them rank the options, which ones were the most important, the most pressing issues they wanted to address, and which ones could be built into the site management plan to be done in the following years. So we worked with the governments and with the Ramsar authorities to integrate these into the management plans for the sites and ensure that they understood the options that were available and how to implement them in the future. While we were doing this, there was another component kind of happening concurrently, which was the citizen journalism training. So this is kind of a unique component, and I think it really ties into this idea of climate justice quite nicely. So what we did was we trained media professionals in the 4 countries on how to use mobile phones to record what is happening in front of them. We did first we did this training of trainers because, of course, in this region there is a huge language barrier. We have 4 countries and 4 different languages. So we used English as the common language with the media professionals from each of the 4 countries. And the Thai public broadcasting system did a training on citizen journalism with these media professionals. The media professionals then went back to their countries and held the citizen journalism trainings with the local communities in the national language so that they had a clear understanding of what the task was, and they really understood how to use the phones and how to use low technology approaches to record and document what's happening in these wetlands and how these wetlands are changing. But also documenting events in the wetlands, so World Wetlands Day events and the ways that they benefit from the wetlands. So then these communities would shoot over the course of about 6 months. They would shoot documentary style reports in the wetlands and then share them with the national media, and then they would be aired on the national news. So it was a really interesting way to bring their voices to the national stage. So you can see in the top the newscasters from Laos introducing a segment from the wetlands themselves. And the communities were quite engaged. They thought it was a really interesting way to get on TV and to share their thoughts and to kind of highlight what's going on in their lives and the importance of wetlands and how they're changing under climate change. So quite unique, but definitely the language barrier, I would say, was one of the bigger challenges there. After we had the results of the adaptation planning and the citizen journalism wrapped up, the final component of the project was to award these small grants to civil society organizations, universities, and local governments to implement some of the EBA measures that were identified from the communities. So the good thing about this was most of the CSOs were working in the sites already, so they already had this really strong relationship with the communities and often with the governments as well. So it made it easier to implement given all of the COVID troubles that were happening at the time. But they were able to implement 17 small grants, and these ranged vastly. So in the top right corner, you can see some seagrass restoration happening. Underneath that, you can see a Buddhist ceremony that's happening in a flooded forest to protect the trees that were going to be cut down and to acknowledge the importance of the flooded forest for this community in the Mekong Basin. Below that, restoration of an endemic water onion to reduce erosion in one of the communities that was facing huge problems of erosion from increased runoff in the basin. There's also broodstock protection in the Tonle Sap Lake to protect the motherfish while they're breeding, and having a closed broodstock fishing season to ensure that there's fish over the next few generations. And then in Myanmar, when we expanded the grants to Myanmar, we had a few CSOs wanting to conduct these climate change vulnerability assessments and use this tool in another country. So it was a great opportunity to pilot how that tool works in other countries and in other wetlands. So overall, a lot of small grants. I don't have time to talk about them all, but really they mostly built on the results of this climate change vulnerability assessment and adaptation planning process. And yeah, they were just finished last year, so we'll see how effective they are over the long term. But so far, all reports seem to be quite good. So I'll leave it there and open up the discussion. Over to you, Arinda.
Thank you very much, Katie, for this overview. And I think one of the things that and we already discussed that before, I really appreciate of your project is the fact that the stage at which the vulnerability assessment was done, right? It was done at a stage where the activities were not yet set in stone. So there was actually the potential to take on board what local communities are needing and what they think also are approaches to be taken. So the ownership was very different. Excuse me very much. And I think that from my perspective, at least, that's key and something that we as practitioners need to keep in mind. We often come already with a very set mindset of what kind of project we want to do. And I think we need to take a step back and see, okay, what is actually needed on the ground? What do the people on the ground want? What are they familiar with? And then, as you said, maybe also building some capacity on what does the concept actually mean, so that they can then make informed decisions themselves on how they would like to approach it, and maybe not want to build a huge water tank. So thanks a lot for that, Katie. I really appreciate the input. So first, I would like to give it to everyone that's here. Is there anyone that has a comment, a question, some reaction to what we just heard now? Just feel free to raise your hand, unmute yourself. And I see already, Emily, you have a question. Would you like to just pose it yourself?
Sure. Thank you so much for the presentations. Really helpful and informative to hear about those efforts and projects. So I guess this is a bit of a specific question for Catherine about the citizen science, and wondering if other types of citizen science, in addition to or other than the journalism training and reporting, were considered, and maybe just any additional reflections you have on citizen science as an engagement and capacity and kind of tool for effective EBA delivery is.
So I actually don't know if other kind of approaches to citizen science were considered, because this project was developed way before I jumped in, much later on. I do know that from the beginning of the project, we had planned to work with Thai PBS, and Thai PBS, as a public broadcasting service, has done a really good job of highlighting community voices, and I think that's why they were selected. So I don't think other options were considered, but I think perhaps they could have been. There's definitely room to integrate those into the project. I think one of the obstacles we found with the citizen journalism that I didn't get to mention was people are busy, and getting them to take 3 days out of their lives of farming and their family and supporting their families, it was difficult. And then asking them to then go out with their phone and record things and edit them and submit that, find a place where they have cell service to send a huge video to the Lao National TV is difficult and requires a lot of effort on their part. In their defense, they did an incredible job of that, but I think in the future we would try to find ways to compensate them for their time I think none of us realized how time intensive it would be, but there's definitely room for improvement on that. And this was the first time we had done it. So yeah, lots of lessons learned there, but thanks for the question.
Thanks, Katie, for that. And yeah, I think definitely a lesson learned when we engage with local communities, we need to think what's in it for them, right? And I think, of course, there's a lot in it for them in terms of actually being able to maintain their livelihoods if they can post on how things are changing, but maybe that's not always at the forefront when one's struggling to feed one's family every day. And I know in the Asian context, normally it's day-to-day income for day-to-day livelihood. So yeah, that's definitely something to consider. I don't know, is there any other comments, questions, or reactions from anyone else here today? Otherwise, in the meantime, we do have maybe also a question for our participants, actually, because we would really like to hear from you. What is your experience in when do you time a vulnerability assessment, for example, and then plan your activities? What are your experiences with that, and what is also your opinion maybe on that? I don't know if anyone would like to chip in. Or other types of assessments that you might need, be it a gender analysis, be it another type of, maybe peace and conflict analysis before you start your project, and how do you deal with the outcomes of that when you have maybe already planned a project? Maybe everyone's a bit shy. I mean, our colleagues here, you with your cameras on, you can also feel free to say your 5 cents on that.
Yeah, I'm happy just to jump in quickly, maybe to get the ball rolling here. So obviously for this project, we did the VA during the project itself, but IUCN is just starting to implement another project with UNEP funded by the Adaptation Fund. And for this, we're using a VA that's been done prior to the project starting, which in a lot of ways saves time. But now that we're looking at some of the adaptation options, we're realizing that they're not actually EBA. So this is a challenge we're facing, right? Because someone has conducted this vulnerability assessment and talked to communities, and the communities have said, we really want to do mushroom farming, but is that EBA? What is the biodiversity benefit there? So we have this, it's great because we're starting a project already knowing what we want to implement, but as we're looking at it, we're realizing it's not exactly in line with the project objectives. So I think there's pros and cons to both.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Timing is everything, right? And maybe also knowing what your objectives are before you do an assessment, for sure.
And maybe just to add, I mean, not that I can offer any solutions, but I think what we've observed with organizations, partner organizations implementing assessments is usually it's part of a project activity, and then there's always this challenge of how do you actually change then possibly the measures that were planned. And I do think that this grants approach is a very smart move. I thought that this was really interesting because usually it's part of an individual project for one organization, and then it can be very difficult to actually say how much flexibility does the donor allow us to then say, well, actually, we're not going to be doing what we said we were doing, but we discovered that there are, more important things to focus on. And I've seen both projects or organizations where that was possible, and then others where it wasn't really possible, and so kind of it didn't really lead to so much. But on the other hand, there's the what we've also seen, and I think this is, especially for smaller organizations, a real problem, is that they do these assessments in the communities, but they don't really have a clear funding afterwards. Where you can really offer a perspective what to do with it. And I think this is, well, I mean, maybe sometimes projects pick it up, but then there's this challenge that you're describing. So I think it really comes down to, maybe there's not so much a good time when to do it, but also, but the question of how do you have the flexibility to actually react and work with these results? And do you have that planned in your project in a way, or do you have a donor or maybe a management staff that allows you the flexibility to actually do that?
Thanks, Christine. I don't know, Katie, do you want to react to that before I hand it over to Mario, or?
Yeah. I just to say, I think we were quite lucky in this project design. So the project proposal actually just said we were planning on working in 10 focal wetlands, and when the project proposal was submitted, we didn't even have those wetlands, pinned down, which of course leads to more work in the project implementation, because then you have to go and make those relationships and get the validation from the governments on the site selection, and then go back to the donor and say, here's the sites we've selected, will you accept these? And it adds a bit of time, but it did give us that flexibility, because I think, as a lot of us know, in the project planning, from the time you start developing a project proposal to the time you actually start implementing the project, a lot can change, a river can be dammed and your Ramsar site might not exist, or a wetland can be reclaimed because it's been turned into a cement plant. So having that flexibility in where we're working and how we're working and who we're working with, I think really made the project more of a success, and especially considering the COVID restrictions later on, having that flexibility on implementing the grants also really helped.
Thanks, Katie. Mario, you have a contribution or question?
Just a comment on the risk or vulnerability assessments. I mean, often the projects tend to invest really big funds and big amounts of money pouring in those vulnerability assessments, and then there's always this question of where to find the compromise between what's really being spent on those kind of analysis and what to use it for, really. And that would be my question to you, Katie. And how far did you really adjust this CVA methodology to really come up with quick but solid information on what should be done, what are the real problems on the ground, in order to, first of all, not to spend too much funds for these works, and also not to what means lose time, but to invest time in doing those kind of preliminary works? Thanks.
Yeah, great question. So the VAs actually focus a lot on literature reviews, so using what's already out there. In terms of climate projections, using publicly available data for even at the country level or at the Mekong Basin level. So not looking at exactly, the township you're working in, but looking at the broader scale to just get ideas of the trends, because often you don't need to know whether it's 0.01 degrees or 0.05 degrees of increase in temperature, right? It doesn't make a huge difference in whether this species will survive or whether this community will have access to water in the dry season. So what the VA does is it really focuses on expert consultation. And I would say the biggest cost for the VA is on just getting the communities together, making sure people are fed, getting the team to the site, and per diems for the government and any experts that you want to bring together and bring into the discussion. So for the species, it recommends, bringing in university researchers who are working on biodiversity, for example. In livelihoods, perhaps bringing in some economic, scientists to look at the economy and people who've worked in the region who understand, what the communities are facing and the history of their economic state in the area. So yeah, making it as feasible as possible. It's a really simple Excel spreadsheet. I can pop the link into the chat so everyone can have a look, but it's designed to be able to be used by non-scientists, I would say. Non-scientists who can consult the right people to get the right information, and who can explain the process to the communities to make sure the communities understand where these results are coming from, and you can simply, present the results in a, without these complicated formulas. And sometimes the complicated formulas are needed, right? But here I don't think they are, especially when we're trying to answer their needs.
Thank you for that, Katie. I absolutely agree with you. And I think one of the key topics I have been working on is simplifying our scientific language so that actually everyone understands what we're talking about, so that everyone can be on board. Language is so important. Actually, Emily shared another resource. Thank you, Emily, for that. So Blue Natural Capital apparently can be an opportunity for funding for vulnerability assessments, cost-benefit analysis, and so on. So I just wanted to say that out loud because the chat will not be part of the recording. But yeah, so we still have 4 minutes left, and I would like to pop in a question that I find very interesting, which is how can the private sector be better integrated as a key partner in supporting just resilience? And yeah, I would be interested to see also from participants if anyone has an experience with that, and otherwise also from our guest speakers here. But yeah, do you have any experience with the private sector being like an entry point or an ally for supporting just resilience? And I mean, they have their own social and responsibilities and so on. So that is definitely a motivation for them. But have you had experience with that actually on the ground? How effective is this? Are there other motivations for the private sector to be part of a just resilience movement? Thanks, Katie, for posting all those resources in the chat. I will see how we can also share that with the documentation of the Knowledge Day, for sure. But maybe, I mean, we have a few guests here. We want to hear from you, right? Anyone brave enough to speak up? Yes, Marion, please.
Yeah, sorry. Anyway, actually, I've been stuck in my thoughts, so I took a long time to speak up. But well, private sector, I don't have the answer for the private. It's also something that we're thinking about, especially for our project, how to engage our private sector, and I think for EBA, and I think considering this climate justice, it suddenly becomes more complicated because for example, in our site, we're exploring about, banana farmers, the plantations in our river basins, and there are a lot of things to consider in terms of the practices of banana farming in our areas, and yeah, and this climate justice, looking at me, making sure, that you don't end up greenwashing these plantations, when you engage them. So I think that's also something you need to look at when it comes to engaging the private sector and considering the climate justice for EBA. And I was also reflecting on the loopholes that were mentioned earlier, and they're really trying to come up, how can we address these loopholes? And I guess for people like us that are, implementing projects, and we all know that the limiting conditions, especially for the timeline and the budget, sometimes you really have to, things that have to, miss out, or I don't want to use the shortcut, but yeah, you have to get things done. So you report to the donor, and how can you get that meaningful stakeholder consultation that we really want to happen, so that it's a just, as we mentioned in the title, it's a just transition and a just resilience that we are able to achieve. So yeah, so I don't know if we have some answers to that, but some things for reflection. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Marion, for that contribution. Definitely. And it's also, I think, one of the points that we've been faced again and again when we're doing now this process on climate justice is this issue around time. Because funding, yes, also, but time, it's so key. And we have so little of it because we're always asked to do projects in 3 to 5 years, because it's also in some way political, in the sense that, our donors have their cycles and we need to kind of adjust to them. But on the ground, it looks so different. So definitely something that we take on board, and it's something we are also thinking about. How can we bring this message across, so that we need some more flexibility in implementation processes so we can do it the right way. Unfortunately, actually, we're running out of time. So I would, if anyone has, yes, Christina, you would like to say your quick contribution to
Yeah,
that.
just very, very briefly, because I think Katie mentioned something really important, and that's planning for a launching phase. And I've seen that in other projects, to plan ahead, to say, this is our first phase where we identify, we enter into dialogue, we have this, and then we set our plan. And I've seen it with another ICI project, and it worked really well. So I think it, and it kind of, it gives you spaces, it gives you funding, it gives you time. So thinking that, or taking that maybe into, you know, other projects, that I think is a very, very good way to go about it. That's all. Sorry.
No, that's great. And I think I fully agree with that. That's definitely something to take on board. So with that, I would like to thank everyone so much, and especially Katie and Christine, for your contributions. I really appreciate it, and I enjoyed it very much as well. And I hope you all have a wonderful closing. So please, I would ask you to go back to the plenary where we will have some closing remarks. And just for you to know, all the documentation will be shared with everyone. The recordings of the other sessions that you missed because you joined us will also be available. So then welcome to look at them later. Thanks a lot and see you soon. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.